In the ancient kingdom of Valdoria, where golden spires pierce morning mists and royal bloodlines stretch back 1,000 years, power has always passed from father to son with ceremonial precision. But tonight, as palace guards discover King Edmund Aldric's empty chambers and cold bed, the very foundations of the realm begin to crack. The crown sits abandoned on his pillow, still warm to the touch, while somewhere in the shadows, Queen Consort Isabel Morwen watches the sunrise with eyes that hold secrets darker than the night that just passed. What the people of Valdoria don't know is that their beloved king didn't simply vanish. He was never meant to rule at all. And the woman they've dismissed as a mere political marriage has been playing a game of thrones that began long before she ever wore a crown. As the kingdom wakes to find their monarch gone, they have no idea that the real battle for Valdoria's soul is just beginning. This is not a story of simple ambition or royal treachery. This is the untold truth of how a forgotten heir reclaimed a stolen birthright, how ancient bloodlines converged in ways that would reshape a kingdom, and how sometimes the greatest threats to a crown come from those who wear it beside you. The disappearance of King Edmund Aldric would become known as the Night of Silent Thunder. But what happened in those crucial hours, and in the months that led to this moment, reveals a web of secrets, forgotten histories, and carefully orchestrated moves that would either save the kingdom of Valdoria or destroy it forever. Welcome to a tale where loyalty is currency, truth is weapon, and the price of a crown is measured not in gold, but in blood, betrayal, and the courage to claim what was always rightfully yours. The kingdom of Valdoria had never known a morning quite like this one. As dawn broke over the crystalline mountains, casting long shadows across the capital city of Aurelius, palace servants went about their usual routines completely unaware that their world had shifted overnight. In the royal quarters, chambermaid Elena Voss knocked gently on the heavy oak doors of the king's private chambers, carrying the traditional morning tea service that had been prepared the same way for 37 years. When no response came, she knocked again, slightly louder this time. King Edmund Aldric was known to be an early riser, often found reading state documents or tending to his prized orchid collection in the palace conservatory before most of the court had even stirred. The silence that greeted her third knock sent an uncomfortable chill down her spine. Elena pushed open the door with the careful deference that had been drilled into every palace servant since childhood. The sight that met her eyes would haunt her for the rest of her days. The king's enormous four-poster bed, carved from ancient Valdorian oak and draped in deep crimson silk, was perfectly made except for a single detail that made no sense. The crown of Valdoria, a magnificent piece crafted from white gold and embedded with 13 sacred gems representing the kingdom's founding provinces, sat carefully placed on the king's pillow. The crown should have been in the royal vault, secured behind 3 separate locks and guarded by the elite Crimson Guard. Instead, it rested there like a final message, its sapphires catching the morning light and casting blue reflections across the empty room. Elena's scream echoed through the palace corridors, bringing guards rushing from every direction. Within minutes, the discovery had reached the ears of Captain Marcus Thorne, head of the royal guard, who immediately sealed the king's chambers and began the most thorough search in the palace's 800-year history. King Edmund Aldric, ruler of Valdoria for the past 15 years, had vanished without a trace. But while chaos erupted in the royal wing, Queen Consort Isabel Morwen sat calmly in her private solar, sipping chamomile tea and reading correspondence as if this were any ordinary morning. She had dismissed her ladies-in-waiting early, claiming a headache that required solitude. Through her windows, she could see the frantic activity in the courtyard below as guards spread out to search every corner of the vast palace grounds. Isabel was a woman who had learned early in life that survival required patience and careful planning. At 42, she possessed the kind of understated elegance that made people underestimate her intelligence. Her dark auburn hair was always perfectly arranged, her green eyes always alert behind their mask of serene composure. She had been queen consort for 12 years, but few in the court truly understood the depths of her ambition or the lengths she would go to protect what she believed was rightfully hers. The marriage between Edmund and Isabel had been arranged for political reasons, as most royal unions were. The kingdom of Valdoria needed to strengthen its ties with the neighboring realm of Morwen, and Isabel, as the daughter of Duke Aldwin Morwen, represented the perfect diplomatic solution. What no one realized at the time was that Isabel's interest in the arrangement went far beyond politics or duty. As she sat in her solar that morning, Isabel reflected on the events that had led to this moment. The story truly began not the night before, but 28 years earlier, in the dusty archives of Morwen Castle, where a young Isabel had discovered a document that would change everything she thought she knew about her family's history. The document, written in the careful script of a court chronicler from the previous century, told the story of Princess Lina Valdoric, King Edmund's great-aunt, who had been declared dead after disappearing during a diplomatic mission to Morwen. According to official Valdorian records, Lina had died tragically in a riding accident while visiting Duke Aldwin's grandfather. Her body was supposedly returned to Valdoria and buried in the royal crypts with all appropriate honors. But the Morwen archives told a different story entirely. Princess Lina had not died in any accident. She had fallen in love with the young Duke of Morwen and had chosen to abandon her royal title to live as his wife. To avoid a diplomatic incident that could have sparked war between the two kingdoms, both courts had agreed to fabricate her death. Lina had lived out her days in Morwen, eventually becoming Isabel's own great-grandmother. This revelation meant that Isabel was not merely a foreign duchess married into the Valdorian royal family for political convenience. She was, by blood, more closely related to the current Valdorian dynasty than Edmund himself. Through Princess Lina's line, Isabel had a legitimate claim to the Valdorian throne that predated Edmund's by an entire generation. The discovery had obsessed young Isabel. She spent years researching bloodlines, studying the ancient laws of succession, and carefully documenting her claim. Under Valdorian law, if a direct male heir died without children, the crown could pass to the nearest blood relative, regardless of gender. Edmund and Isabel had never had children despite 12 years of marriage, a fact that had become a source of constant speculation and whispered gossip throughout the court. As she grew older, Isabel realized that simply revealing her heritage would never be enough. The political establishment would resist any attempt to change the succession, especially one that elevated a woman to the throne. She needed to be subtle, patient, and, above all, she needed the current king to be removed from the picture in a way that would not immediately point suspicion toward her. Edmund's disappearance had been planned for 3 years. Isabel had carefully cultivated relationships with key members of the palace staff, gradually placing her own people in crucial positions. She had studied Edmund's habits, his routines, his fears, and his weaknesses. Most importantly, she had discovered the one secret that Edmund would do anything to protect, even if it meant abandoning his crown. Edmund was not actually the biological son of the late King Richard Aldrich. The truth was something Isabel had uncovered through a combination of careful investigation and sheer luck. During a renovation of the royal private chambers 2 years earlier, workers had discovered a hidden compartment behind a false wall. Inside were letters written by Queen Mother Catherine to her sister, detailing a passionate affair she had conducted with Sir Garret Vale, the former master of horse, during the early years of her marriage to King Richard. The letters made it clear that Edmund was actually Sir Garret's son, not King Richard's. Queen Mother Catherine had managed to conceal the truth by timing the announcement of her pregnancy carefully and ensuring that Sir Garret was sent away on an extended diplomatic mission before Edmund's birth. King Richard had died believing Edmund was his legitimate heir, and Catherine had taken the secret to her grave 3 years ago. But Isabel now possessed copies of those letters, along with other evidence that would completely destroy Edmund's claim to the throne if made public. She had used this knowledge not to blackmail Edmund directly, but to create a situation where he would willingly choose exile over exposure. The night before, Isabel had finally confronted Edmund with the truth about his parentage. She had presented him with 2 choices: face a public trial that would not only remove him from the throne but also destroy the memory of his beloved mother, and potentially destabilize the entire kingdom, or disappear quietly and allow the succession to pass to its rightful heir. Edmund, who had always been a man of honor despite his illegitimate birth, had chosen the path that would cause the least harm to Valdoria. He had agreed to leave the kingdom voluntarily, on the condition that Isabel would rule justly and protect the people he had served for 15 years. As Isabel sat in her solar, she knew that the next few hours would be crucial. The royal council would need to be convened, the succession laws would need to be reviewed, and her own claim would need to be carefully presented to avoid the appearance of a coup. She had already prepared documentation proving her descent from Princess Lina, verified by 3 independent scholars and supported by records from both Valdorian and Morwen archives. The morning sun climbed higher over Aurelius as news of the king's disappearance began to spread beyond the palace walls. In the markets and taverns, people spoke in hushed voices about what this might mean for their kingdom. Some wondered if Edmund had been kidnapped by enemies of the realm. Others speculated about political intrigue within the court. None suspected that their quiet, elegant queen consort was about to reveal herself as their new sovereign. Captain Marcus Thorne had completed his search of the palace and found no trace of King Edmund beyond the symbolic placement of the crown. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry, and no witnesses who had seen anything unusual during the night. It was as if the king had simply chosen to walk away from his throne, leaving behind only the most important symbol of his rule. As noon approached, Isabel knew it was time to act. She had spent the morning in carefully orchestrated isolation, allowing the palace to descend into controlled chaos while she prepared for her entrance onto the stage of history. She had changed from her simple morning dress into formal court attire, a gown of deep emerald silk that complemented her eyes and emphasized her regal bearing. Around her neck, she wore a necklace that had belonged to Princess Lyanna, a piece that would soon become significant evidence of her legitimate claim. The great bell of Aurelius Cathedral began to toll, calling the royal council to an emergency session. As the sound echoed across the kingdom, Isabel Morwen took one last look at herself in her mirror, straightened her shoulders, and prepared to claim her destiny. The woman who had entered the kingdom of Valdoria 12 years ago as a diplomatic bride was about to emerge as its rightful queen. And, as she made her way through the palace corridors toward the council chamber, she carried with her not just the evidence of her royal bloodline, but also the burden of the choices she had made to secure her throne. The transformation of Valdoria was about to begin, and history would remember this day as the moment when Queen Isabel Morwen stepped out of the shadows and into the light of absolute power. But whether that power would be used to heal the kingdom or reshape it according to her own vision remained to be seen. The crown that had sat so symbolically on Edmund's pillow that morning would soon rest on a different head entirely, and the kingdom of Valdoria would never be the same. The royal council chamber had not seen such tension in living memory. As the 12 most powerful nobles in Valdoria took their seats around the ancient stone table, the air itself seemed to crackle with uncertainty and fear. Lord Chancellor Vincent Ashford, a man whose family had served the crown for 6 generations, called the emergency session to order with a voice that betrayed none of the panic that had gripped the palace since dawn. The chamber itself was a testament to Valdorian history, its walls lined with portraits of kings and queens stretching back centuries. Ancient battle flags hung from the vaulted ceiling, and the Great Seal of Valdoria was carved into the floor at the center of the room. Under normal circumstances, King Edmund would have sat at the head of the table, his presence commanding respect and maintaining order. Today, that chair remained conspicuously empty. "My lords and ladies," Chancellor Ashford began, his weathered hands gripping the ceremonial staff of office, "we are gathered under the most extraordinary circumstances. His Majesty King Edmund Aldrich has vanished from the palace without explanation. A thorough search has revealed no trace of his whereabouts, no signs of foul play, and no indication of his intentions." Duke William Blackwood, the kingdom's most senior military commander, leaned forward in his seat. At 65, Blackwood had served 3 kings and was known for his direct manner and unwavering loyalty to the crown. "Has anyone spoken with Queen Consort Isabel? Surely she must have some insight into the king's state of mind or possible destinations." "Her Majesty has been notified and will join us shortly," Ashford replied. "She claims to have no knowledge of the king's plans or current whereabouts." Lady Margaret Hartwell, the only other woman on the council besides Isabel, spoke up from her position near the window. As the kingdom's master of coin, she was responsible for Valdoria's financial stability and was deeply concerned about the economic implications of a missing monarch. "We must consider the immediate practical consequences. Trade negotiations with 3 neighboring kingdoms are scheduled for next week. The Harvest Festival proclamation needs the royal seal. And there are 7 death sentences awaiting the king's review." "More importantly," interrupted Lord Thomas Ravencrest, the youngest member of the council at 38, "we need to consider the question of succession. If the king is truly gone, if he has abdicated his responsibilities, what does that mean for the crown?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Ravencrest was known to be ambitious and had never fully accepted the legitimacy of Edmund's rule, though he had never been foolish enough to voice such thoughts publicly. His words now carried an edge that suggested he saw opportunity in the current crisis. It was at this moment that the great doors of the chamber opened, and Queen Consort Isabel entered with the fluid grace that had made her famous throughout the court. She was accompanied by Sir Adrian Montclair, her personal advisor, and a man whose loyalty to her was absolute. Isabel had chosen her allies carefully over the years, and Montclair represented the new generation of nobles who believed that Valdoria needed stronger, more decisive leadership. As she took her seat at the table, Isabel allowed herself a moment to study the faces around her. These were the men and women who would determine her fate over the next few hours. Some, like Duke Blackwood, were traditionalists who would resist any dramatic change. Others, like Lord Ravencrest, might be persuaded to support her if she could offer them something valuable in return. Your Majesty, Chancellor Ashford said with a respectful bow of his head, we are deeply sorry for your distress during this difficult time. Can you shed any light on His Majesty's disappearance? Isabel had rehearsed this moment countless times in her mind. Her response needed to be believable without being too detailed, emotional without appearing overly dramatic. She folded her hands carefully in her lap and spoke with a voice that carried just the right note of controlled anguish. My lords and ladies, I wish I could provide you with answers, but I fear I am as mystified as you are. Edmund seemed troubled in recent days, but he would not share the source of his concerns with me. Last night, he retired to his chambers as usual. This morning, I learned of his absence along with the rest of the palace. She paused, allowing a slight tremor to enter her voice. I can only pray that no harm has come to him, and that he will return to us safely. In the meantime, we must consider what is best for the kingdom. Lord Ravencrest seized the opening she had provided. Indeed, Your Majesty, the kingdom's stability must be our primary concern. If the king has truly abandoned his duties, we must move quickly to establish legitimate authority. Duke Blackwood's face darkened. The king has not abandoned anything, Ravencrest. He has been missing for less than 24 hours. We should be organizing search parties, not discussing succession. With respect, Your Grace, Isabel interjected gently. While we certainly hope and pray for Edmund's safe return, we cannot ignore our responsibilities to the people of Valdoria. They need to know that their government remains stable and that their interests are being protected. Lady Hartwell nodded in agreement. The Queen Consort speaks wisely. Markets are already responding to rumors of the king's disappearance. If we appear weak or indecisive, it could trigger economic panic. Sir Adrian Montclair, who had remained silent until now, produced a leather satchel from beneath his cloak. My lords and ladies, before we proceed further, there is information that Her Majesty feels must be shared with this council. Information that may shed light on recent events and help guide our decisions. The tension in the room increased noticeably as Isabel reached into the satchel and withdrew a collection of documents. She arranged them carefully on the table before her, making sure each council member could see the official seals and signatures that authenticated their contents. What I am about to share with you, Isabel began, her voice taking on a tone of formal authority, may come as a shock, but it is information that can no longer remain hidden. These documents, recently discovered in the royal archives, reveal details about our kingdom's history that change our understanding of the legitimate line of succession. She lifted the first document, a genealogical chart that had been prepared by the kingdom's most respected historians. As you can see, my great-grandmother was Princess Lyanna Valdoric, sister to King Edmund's grandfather, King Harold Aldrich. Princess Lyanna was declared dead after a diplomatic mission to Morwen, but these records prove that she actually lived and married into the Morwen family. Duke Blackwood studied the document with obvious skepticism. These are serious claims, Your Majesty. How do we know these documents are authentic? Sir Adrian stood and produced 3 additional scrolls, each bearing different official seals. These are verification letters from the Royal College of Heralds, the Archive Masters of Morwen, and the Independent Society of Genealogical Scholars. All 3 institutions have confirmed the authenticity of these records and the validity of Her Majesty's bloodline. The implications of what Isabel was presenting began to dawn on the council members. If her claims were true, she was not merely a foreign consort married to the king for political reasons. She was actually a member of the Valdorian royal family with her own claim to the throne. Lord Ravencrest was the first to grasp the full significance. Are you suggesting, Your Majesty, that you have a claim to the crown that predates King Edmund's? I am not suggesting anything, Isabel replied carefully. I am simply presenting facts that have come to light. Princess Lina was older than King Harold by 2 years, which means her line would have precedence under ancient Valdorian succession law, particularly in the absence of direct male heirs. Chancellor Ashford's face had gone pale as he studied the documents. As keeper of the kingdom's laws, he understood better than anyone what Isabel was implying. Your Majesty, are you formally asserting a claim to the throne? I am asserting my right to be considered in any discussion of succession, Isabel answered. Given the current circumstances, given the uncertainty surrounding Edmund's fate, and given the need for strong, legitimate leadership, I believe it is my duty to make this information available to the council. The chamber erupted in heated discussion as council members struggled to process this unexpected revelation. Duke Blackwood was clearly outraged, his military bearing making his anger impossible to conceal. This is preposterous. King Edmund is the rightful ruler of Valdoria, chosen by birth and crowned according to our ancient traditions. You cannot simply produce documents and claim the throne. But Lady Hartwell was already studying the genealogical charts with obvious interest. As someone who dealt with complex financial transactions and legal documents daily, she could recognize authentic historical records when she saw them. The documentation appears legitimate, Your Grace. And our succession laws do provide for contingencies when the direct line is compromised. The direct line is not compromised, Blackwood roared. The king is missing, not dead. Isabel had anticipated this exact objection and was prepared with her response. You are absolutely correct, Your Grace. Edmund is missing, not dead. But he is also absent, unable to fulfill his duties to the kingdom. In such circumstances, our laws require us to consider alternative arrangements to ensure governmental continuity. Sir Adrian produced another document from the satchel. Additionally, there is the question of King Edmund's legitimacy. The words fell like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread throughout the chamber. Even Isabel appeared surprised by this revelation, though she had of course planned this moment carefully. What are you suggesting? Chancellor Ashford demanded. I'm not suggesting anything, Sir Adrian replied smoothly. I'm stating facts that have been confirmed through careful investigation. These letters, discovered during recent renovations of the royal chambers, reveal that Queen Mother Catherine had an extended affair with Sir Garret Vale. The timing of these letters coincides exactly with the period when King Edmund would have been conceived. He placed photocopies of the letters on the table, though he kept the originals securely in the satchel. As you can see, Queen Mother Catherine's own words make it clear that Sir Garret was the father of her child. King Edmund is not actually the biological son of King Richard Aldrich. The silence that followed this revelation was deafening. For several long minutes, no one spoke as the council members absorbed the implications of what they were hearing. If Edmund was illegitimate, his entire reign was based on false premises. If Isabel's claim to royal blood was genuine, she might actually be the rightful ruler of Valdoria. Duke Blackwood was the first to find his voice, though it was hoarse with emotion. Even if these allegations were true, which I do not accept, it would not automatically invalidate King Edmund's reign. He was crowned according to proper procedures. He has ruled justly for 15 years, and he has the loyalty of the people. But he does not have the protection of legitimate birth, Lord Ravencrest countered. And, in his absence, the kingdom needs leadership that cannot be questioned or challenged. Lady Hartwell nodded slowly. The economic implications alone are staggering. If questions about the king's legitimacy become public knowledge, it could destabilize our currency, destroy our trading relationships, and potentially lead to civil unrest. Isabel watched the debate with careful attention, gauging each council member's position and calculating how to win over those who remained undecided. She knew that she needed more than just legal documentation to secure her claim. She needed to demonstrate that she was not merely taking advantage of a crisis, but actually offering the kingdom a better future. My lords and ladies, she said, rising from her seat with queenly dignity, I understand that what I have presented today is shocking and difficult to accept. I do not ask you to make any immediate decisions, but I do ask you to consider what is best for Valdoria. She moved around the table, making eye contact with each council member as she spoke. For 12 years, I have served this kingdom faithfully as your queen consort. I have learned its customs, studied its laws, and grown to love its people. I have also observed its challenges and understand what changes are needed to ensure our continued prosperity and security. What kind of changes? Duke Blackwood asked suspiciously. Isabel had prepared for this question as well. Changes that strengthen our military defenses, improve our trade relationships, and modernize our agricultural systems. Changes that prepare Valdoria for the challenges of the next century rather than clinging to the traditions of the last one. She returned to her seat and looked directly at Chancellor Ashford. I propose that this council grant me temporary authority to act as regent until King Edmund's fate is determined. If he returns and wishes to reclaim his throne, we can address the questions of legitimacy at that time. If he does not return, or if he chooses not to return, then the kingdom will have time to adjust to new leadership gradually and peacefully. The proposal was clever, offering a compromise that avoided immediate confrontation while establishing Isabel's authority. It also placed the burden of opposing her on those council members who might have reservations, forcing them to argue against stability and continuity. Lord Ravencrest was the first to voice his support. The Queen Consort's proposal has merit. Temporary regency would provide stability while allowing time for proper investigation of all claims and circumstances. Lady Hartwell agreed. From an economic standpoint, it makes sense. The markets need to see decisive leadership, and Her Majesty is already known and respected by our trading partners. One by one, the other council members began to indicate their support, some enthusiastically and others with obvious reluctance. Duke Blackwood held out the longest, but eventually even he had to acknowledge that some form of interim government was necessary. As the sun set over the Kingdom of Valdoria, the Royal Council formally voted to appoint Queen Isabel Morwen as regent, with full executive authority until such time as King Edmund Aldrich returned to reclaim his throne. The vote was not unanimous, but it was decisive enough to provide legitimacy to Isabel's new position. That evening, as she stood on the balcony of what had been Edmund's private study and was now hers, Isabel reflected on how much her life had changed in a single day. She was no longer simply a queen consort, a decorative figure whose primary role was to produce heirs and attend state functions. She was now the acting ruler of one of the most powerful kingdoms in the known world. But even as she savored her victory, she knew that the real work was just beginning. Establishing her regency had been only the first step in a much larger plan. To secure her position permanently, she would need to prove herself as an effective leader, eliminate potential threats to her authority, and gradually transform the kingdom according to her vision. The Game of Thrones that had begun with a missing king was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. 3 months had passed since Queen Isabel Morwen assumed the regency of Valdoria, and the kingdom had begun to experience changes that rippled through every level of society. What had started as a temporary arrangement to maintain stability in the wake of King Edmund's mysterious disappearance was gradually transforming into something more permanent and more ambitious than anyone had initially imagined. The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of the royal study as Isabel reviewed reports from across her domain. The room itself reflected the changes she had implemented since taking power. Where Edmund had preferred dark, heavy furniture and traditional tapestries depicting ancient battles, Isabel had introduced lighter colors, more efficient organization, and modern maps that showed not just Valdoria's current borders, but potential areas for expansion and development. Sir Adrian Montclair entered the study carrying a leather portfolio filled with the day's most pressing matters. Over the past 3 months, he had evolved from merely Isabel's personal advisor to her chief minister, effectively replacing the traditional royal council structure with a more streamlined system that allowed for faster decision-making and implementation of new policies. Your Majesty, Adrian said, using the title that Isabel had gradually encouraged her supporters to adopt, the agricultural reforms you implemented last month are showing remarkable results. Crop yields in the eastern provinces are up 15%, and the new irrigation systems have reduced dependency on seasonal rainfall. Isabel smiled as she reviewed the detailed reports. One of her first major initiatives as regent had been to modernize Valdoria's farming methods, introducing techniques she had learned about during her diplomatic travels before her marriage to Edmund. The traditional nobility had initially resisted these changes, viewing them as unnecessary and expensive, but the results were becoming impossible to ignore. What about resistance from the landowners? She asked, though she already knew the answer from previous reports. Minimal and decreasing, Adrian replied. Duke Blackwood continues to voice concerns about the pace of change, but even he has had to acknowledge the improved productivity on his own estates. The farmers themselves are overwhelmingly supportive. and their increased prosperity is beginning to influence public opinion in your favor. This had been a crucial part of Isabel's strategy. Rather than focusing primarily on winning over the noble families who had traditionally controlled power in Valdoria, she had deliberately courted the support of merchants, farmers, and skilled craftsmen who formed the backbone of the kingdom's economy. By improving their lives and livelihoods, she was creating a base of popular support that would be difficult for any challenger to overcome. The transformation of Valdoria under Isabel's rule extended far beyond agricultural policy. She had restructured the kingdom's trade relationships, negotiating more favorable agreements with neighboring realms, and opening new markets for Valdorian goods. The treasury, which had been slowly depleting under Edmund's conservative fiscal policies, was now showing significant growth. There's also news from our intelligence network, Adrian continued, lowering his voice slightly. Our agents in the border regions report increasing curiosity from neighboring kingdoms about the changes happening here. Some view our rapid development as an opportunity for partnership. Others see it as a potential threat. Isabel had not been naive about the international implications of her rise to power. The sudden appearance of a strong, ambitious female ruler in a region traditionally dominated by male monarchs had already begun to shift diplomatic calculations throughout the continent. She had spent considerable effort over the past 3 months building new alliances while carefully managing existing relationships. "What about the kingdom of Aldwyck?" she asked, referring to Valdoria's most powerful neighbor and occasional rival. "King Harold of Aldwyck has requested a formal audience. He's curious about our new leadership and wants to assess whether you represent an opportunity or a threat to his own interests." This was exactly the kind of international recognition that Isabel had been working toward. By demonstrating effective governance and economic growth, she was gradually establishing her legitimacy not just within Valdoria, but among the broader community of regional powers. "Schedule the audience for next month," she decided. "Make sure our preparations emphasize Valdoria's strength and prosperity under the new administration." As Adrian made notes about the diplomatic arrangements, Isabel's attention was drawn to a commotion in the courtyard below. Through her window, she could see a small crowd gathered around someone who appeared to be making a public declaration. She recognized the figure immediately, Brother Marcus, a monk from the nearby monastery who had become increasingly vocal in his criticism of her rule. Brother Marcus represented a different type of challenge than the political opposition she faced from traditionalist nobles. As a religious figure, he commanded respect from a significant portion of the population, and his criticism of Isabel was based on moral and theological grounds rather than purely political ones. He argued that a woman's assumption of royal authority violated divine law and that Edmund's disappearance was actually a test of the kingdom's faithfulness. "Adrian," Isabel said, pointing toward the window. "It appears Brother Marcus is holding another of his impromptu sermons. What is he saying this time?" Adrian moved to the window and listened carefully to the monk's words, which carried clearly through the morning air. "He's claiming that the recent prosperity is temporary and that divine judgment will eventually fall on a kingdom that has abandoned proper order. He's calling for King Edmund's return and questioning the legitimacy of female rule." This was a delicate situation that required careful handling. Isabel could not simply suppress religious criticism without appearing tyrannical, but she also could not allow Brother Marcus to undermine her authority unopposed. Over the past 3 months, she had developed a sophisticated approach to managing such challenges. "Send word to Abbess Catherine at the Convent of Sacred Light," Isabel instructed. "Invite her to provide a counter-perspective on women's roles in leadership. Make sure her words reach the same audiences that hear Brother Marcus." Abbess Catherine was a formidable intellectual who had been running one of Valdoria's most important religious institutions for over 20 years. She represented a more progressive interpretation of religious law and had privately expressed support for Isabel's rule. By encouraging a theological debate rather than simply suppressing criticism, Isabel could demonstrate both tolerance and confidence in her position. The broader question of Edmund's fate remained a constant undercurrent in Valdorian politics. Official searches for the missing king had continued for weeks after his disappearance, but had gradually been scaled back as other priorities demanded attention. Most people now assumed that Edmund was either dead or had chosen permanent exile for reasons known only to himself. Isabel knew, of course, exactly what had happened to Edmund, though she had shared that knowledge with no one except Edmund himself. The former king had indeed chosen exile, and she had helped facilitate his departure to a distant kingdom where he could live quietly under an assumed identity. It was an arrangement that served both of their interests. Edmund could avoid the public humiliation of having his illegitimate birth exposed, and Isabel could rule without the constant threat of his return. But the official mystery of Edmund's disappearance served useful political purposes. It allowed her to maintain the fiction of temporary regency while gradually consolidating permanent power. It also prevented her opponents from rallying around a legitimate alternative claimant to the throne. As the morning progressed, Isabel received a series of visitors who demonstrated the evolving nature of power in Valdoria. Lady Margaret Hartwell arrived first, bringing detailed financial reports that confirmed the kingdom's improved economic position. The Master of Coin had become one of Isabel's strongest supporters, impressed by her practical approach to governance and her willingness to make decisions based on evidence rather than tradition. "Your Majesty," Lady Hartwell said as she spread charts and ledgers across the study table, "our tax revenues are up 23% over the same period last year, primarily due to increased trade and agricultural productivity. We're also seeing significant growth in manufacturing, particularly in textiles and metalwork." The economic transformation of Valdoria under Isabel's rule was perhaps her greatest achievement and her strongest source of legitimacy. By focusing on practical improvements rather than grand gestures, she had created tangible benefits that ordinary people could see and appreciate in their daily lives. "What about military expenditures?" Isabel asked, knowing that defense spending would be crucial to her long-term security. "Increased by 12%, but still well within sustainable limits. The new training programs you authorized are producing more effective soldiers, and the equipment improvements are making our forces more competitive with neighboring kingdoms." Military reform had been another of Isabel's early priorities. She had inherited a competent but somewhat outdated army from Edmund, and had worked steadily to modernize both tactics and equipment. More importantly, she had focused on promoting officers based on merit rather than family connections, creating a generation of military leaders who owed their advancement to her rule. Duke William Blackwood arrived next, representing the traditional nobility's perspective on recent changes. At 75, Blackwood remained physically imposing and mentally sharp, but his influence had declined significantly as Isabel consolidated power around newer institutions and relationships. "Your Majesty," Blackwood said with the formal courtesy that barely concealed his ongoing skepticism, "I come to discuss concerns about the pace of change in our kingdom. While I acknowledge the economic benefits of your policies, I worry that we're abandoning traditions that have served Valdoria well for centuries." Isabel had anticipated this conversation and had prepared her response carefully. She needed to address Blackwood's concerns without appearing to retreat from her reform agenda, while also demonstrating respect for his long service to the kingdom. "Your Grace, I appreciate your perspective and your commitment to Valdorian values," she replied. "But I would argue that the best way to honor our traditions is to ensure that our kingdom remains strong and prosperous. The world around us is changing, and we must adapt to remain competitive." "Perhaps," Blackwood conceded, "but change should be gradual and carefully considered. Some of your reforms seem designed more to consolidate your own power than to serve the kingdom's interests." It was a direct challenge that required an equally direct response. Isabel looked Blackwood in the eye as she spoke, her voice carrying the authority she had developed over months of wielding real power. "Your Grace, everything I have done has been designed to strengthen Valdoria's position and improve our people's lives. If that also happens to consolidate effective leadership, then I consider that a beneficial side effect rather than a primary motivation." The conversation continued for another hour, covering topics ranging from noble privileges to military appointments to religious policy. By the end, neither Isabel nor Blackwood had changed the other's fundamental position, but they had established a framework for continued cooperation despite their philosophical differences. As evening approached, Isabel found herself alone in the royal study for the first time all day. She moved to the great window that overlooked the capital city of Aurelius and watched as thousands of oil lamps began to flicker to life in homes and businesses throughout the urban landscape. The city had changed noticeably during her 3 months as regent. New construction was visible in several districts, expanded markets bustled with increased activity, and the general atmosphere seemed more energetic and optimistic than it had been under Edmund's more cautious administration. But Isabel also knew that her greatest challenges lay ahead rather than behind her. She had successfully established her authority and demonstrated her competence as a ruler, but she had not yet secured her position permanently. There were still those who viewed her as a temporary placeholder rather than a legitimate monarch, and the question of succession remained unresolved. Sir Adrian returned to the study as the last light faded from the sky, carrying news that would prove to be a turning point in Isabel's reign. "Your Majesty," he said with barely contained excitement, "we've received word from our agents in the eastern provinces. A group of nobles led by Lord Ravencrest is planning to formally petition for your permanent coronation as Queen of Valdoria." This was the development Isabel had been hoping for but had not wanted to orchestrate directly. By allowing the initiative to come from other nobles rather than proposing it herself, she could maintain the appearance of reluctant duty rather than naked ambition. "What are the terms of their petition?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "They're arguing that Edmund's continued absence, combined with questions about his legitimacy, creates an urgent need for permanent leadership. They want to invoke the ancient law of succession that allows the crown to pass to the nearest blood relative in cases of abdication or illegitimacy." It was exactly the legal framework Isabel had been hoping someone would propose. By accepting a petition from other nobles rather than claiming the throne directly, she could become queen while maintaining the fiction that she had never sought power for its own sake. "How much support does Ravencrest have for this petition?" she asked. "At least 7 of the 12 major noble houses, with 2 more leaning in favor. Only Blackwood and his closest allies remain firmly opposed." The mathematics of political support were working in Isabel's favor. She had spent 3 months proving her competence as a leader and building coalitions among different groups within Valdorian society. The combination of improved economic conditions, effective governance, and careful relationship building was finally producing the result she had planned from the beginning. As she stood in the royal study that night, looking out over a kingdom that was increasingly accepting her as their rightful ruler, Isabel reflected on how completely her life had changed since that morning when Edmund's empty bed had been discovered. What had begun as a carefully planned coup was evolving into something larger and more significant: the transformation of Valdoria itself. The woman who had once been dismissed as a mere diplomatic bride was now on the verge of becoming the first queen regnant in Valdorian history. But, more than that, she was reshaping the very nature of royal authority in ways that would influence the kingdom for generations to come. The crown that had been left symbolically on Edmund's pillow 6 months ago would soon rest permanently on her own head. And when it did, it would represent not just a change in rulership, but a fundamental evolution in how power was understood and exercised in the kingdom of Valdoria. The third act of her rise to power was drawing to a close, but the greatest challenges and opportunities of her reign were still to come. The great cathedral of Aurelius had never witnessed a ceremony quite like the one taking place on this crisp autumn morning. For 8 centuries, Valdorian coronations had followed the same ancient ritual, with male heirs receiving the crown from the archbishop in a ceremony that emphasized divine approval and hereditary right. Today, Queen Isabel Morwen was about to become the first woman in the kingdom's history to be crowned as sovereign ruler rather than consort. The cathedral itself had been transformed for the occasion. Golden banners bearing both the traditional Valdorian royal arms and the newly designed coat of arms representing Isabel's claim through Princess Lyanna hung from every pillar. Representatives from 12 neighboring kingdoms filled the ornate pews, their presence serving as international recognition of Valdoria's new monarchy. The ceremony was intended to demonstrate not just Isabel's authority within her own realm, but her legitimacy among the broader community of regional powers. As dawn broke over the capital city, thousands of citizens gathered in the streets surrounding the cathedral. The crowd included farmers who had prospered under Isabel's agricultural reforms, merchants whose businesses had expanded due to her trade policies, and craftsmen who had benefited from increased construction and development projects. For many of them, this coronation represented validation of improvements they had experienced in their own lives over the past 6 months. But the crowd also included skeptics and critics. Brother Marcus stood on the cathedral steps with a small group of supporters, holding a vigil of prayer for what he termed the restoration of proper order. Duke William Blackwood had publicly announced his attendance at the ceremony, but his expression as he entered the cathedral made clear that his presence was driven by duty rather than enthusiasm. Inside the royal palace, Isabel underwent the elaborate preparation ritual that traditionally preceded coronations. The process had been modified to reflect her unique circumstances, incorporating elements that emphasized both her Valdorian royal heritage and her own achievements as ruler. Lady Margaret Hartwell served as her chief attendant, a choice that symbolized the new alliance between royal authority and practical governance. The coronation gown itself was a masterpiece of political symbolism. Created by the kingdom's finest seamstresses and embroiderers, it combined traditional Valdorian colors with design elements that reflected Isabel's connection to the Morwen family. The fabric was woven with gold thread that caught the light as she moved, and the intricate embroidery depicted scenes from Valdorian history, including representations of Princess Lina and other significant female figures from the kingdom's past. As Isabel prepared for the ceremony, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 months ago, she had been a queen consort with limited official authority and no guarantee that her carefully laid plans would succeed. Today, she was about to become the undisputed ruler of one of the continent's most prosperous kingdoms. Sir Adrian Montclair entered the royal chambers carrying the final details that needed Isabel's approval before the ceremony. As her chief minister, he had been instrumental in managing the political and logistical challenges of organizing a coronation under such unprecedented circumstances. Your Majesty, Adrian said, using the title that would become officially accurate in just a few hours. The foreign delegations have all arrived and taken their assigned positions. King Harold of Aldwyck appears particularly impressed by the ceremonial preparations. His ambassador indicated that Aldwyck is ready to formalize new trade agreements immediately following your coronation. This international recognition was crucial to Isabel's long-term security. By demonstrating that neighboring kingdoms accepted her legitimacy, she could discourage any domestic opponents who might be considering armed resistance to her rule. The presence of foreign royalty also elevated the ceremony's significance, making it a regional event rather than merely a Valdorian succession. What about the domestic nobles? Isabel asked, though she had been monitoring their positions carefully throughout the preparation period. Lord Ravencrest will deliver the formal petition requesting your coronation, as planned. 8 of the 12 major houses have signed the petition, with 2 more indicating support. Only Duke Blackwood and Lord Garrett continue to express reservations, but both have agreed to witness the ceremony and accept its legitimacy. The political mathematics had continued to evolve in Isabel's favor over the past 3 months. As her competence as a ruler became increasingly evident, even some initial skeptics had begun to acknowledge the benefits of her leadership. The formal petition from the noble houses provided the legal framework necessary to transform her regency into permanent sovereignty. Archbishop Theodore, who would perform the coronation ceremony, had initially expressed theological concerns about crowning a female monarch. However, extensive consultations with religious scholars and careful review of ancient Valdorian law had satisfied most of his objections. The presence of Abbess Catherine and several other prominent religious figures who supported Isabel's rule had also helped to legitimize the ceremony from a spiritual perspective. As the morning sun climbed higher over Aurelius, the great bells of the cathedral began to ring, calling all participants to take their positions for the historic ceremony. Isabel made her way through the palace corridors that she now knew better than Edmund ever had, accompanied by a procession of nobles, advisors, and ceremonial guards. The walk to the cathedral took her through the heart of the capital city, providing an opportunity for thousands of citizens to see their new queen and demonstrate their support or opposition. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with cheers and applause echoing from every street corner. Young girls held up flowers, while merchants and farmers called out their appreciation for the policies that had improved their livelihoods. Inside the cathedral, the atmosphere was electric with anticipation and nervous energy. The ancient stone walls seemed to vibrate with the weight of history being made, as representatives of Valdorian society prepared to witness the transformation of their kingdom's political structure. Archbishop Theodore began the ceremony with traditional prayers and invocations, but the ritual had been carefully modified to acknowledge the unique circumstances of Isabel's accession. Rather than simply inheriting the crown through male primogeniture, she was being elevated to sovereignty through a combination of bloodline legitimacy, demonstrated competence, and popular acclaim. Lord Ravencrest stepped forward to deliver the formal petition that provided the legal basis for the coronation. His speech was carefully crafted to emphasize both the necessity of permanent leadership and Isabel's qualifications to provide that leadership. My lords and ladies, honored guests, and faithful subjects of Valdoria, Ravencrest declared, his voice carrying clearly throughout the packed cathedral. "We gather today to address a crisis that has threatened our kingdom's stability and to celebrate a solution that promises to strengthen our realm for generations to come." He went on to detail the circumstances of King Edmund's disappearance, the questions that had been raised about his legitimacy, and the demonstrated benefits of Isabel's leadership during her months as regent. The speech was designed to present her coronation not as a power grab, but as a necessary response to extraordinary circumstances. "Therefore," Ravencrest concluded, "we petition that Isabel of House Morwen, legitimate descendant of Princess Lina Valdoric, proven leader and faithful servant of our people, be crowned as rightful Queen of Valdoria." The formal petition was followed by responses from representatives of different segments of Valdorian society. Lady Hartwell spoke on behalf of the merchant class, emphasizing the economic prosperity that had flourished under Isabel's governance. Captain Marcus Thorne, now fully converted to supporting the new regime, detailed the military improvements that had strengthened the kingdom's defenses. Most significantly, a delegation of common farmers and craftsmen had been given an opportunity to address the assembled nobles and foreign dignitaries. This was an unprecedented break from traditional coronation ceremonies, but it reflected Isabel's commitment to drawing legitimacy from broad-based support rather than relying solely on noble approval. When the time came for the actual crowning, Archbishop Theodore approached Isabel with visible emotion. The crown itself had been modified for the occasion, incorporating gems that had belonged to Princess Lina and design elements that reflected both Valdorian tradition and Isabel's own achievements. "Isabel of House Morwen," the Archbishop declared, his voice echoing through the cathedral, "do you solemnly swear to govern the people of this kingdom of Valdoria according to their respective laws and customs, to cause law and justice to be administered with mercy, and to protect and defend this realm to the utmost of your power?" "I solemnly promise so to do," Isabel replied, her voice steady and clear despite the magnitude of the moment. As the crown settled onto her head, officially transforming her from regent to queen, the cathedral erupted in applause and celebration. But, for Isabel, the moment was less about personal triumph than about the responsibility she was accepting. She was now solely accountable for the welfare of hundreds of thousands of people and the future direction of an entire kingdom. The ceremony continued with traditional elements including the presentation of the royal scepter and orb, the reading of ancient oaths, and formal recognition from both domestic and foreign dignitaries. Each element served to reinforce the legitimacy of Isabel's new position while acknowledging the historic nature of her accession. Following the cathedral ceremony, the celebration moved to the royal palace for an elaborate feast that brought together representatives from every level of Valdorian society. The guest list itself was a statement about the kind of monarchy Isabel intended to establish, one that valued competence and contribution over hereditary privilege alone. During the feast, Isabel had the opportunity to conduct informal diplomacy with the foreign representatives who had attended her coronation. King Harold of Aldwyck proved particularly interested in discussing expanded trade relationships, while ambassadors from other kingdoms expressed curiosity about the governance innovations that had produced such rapid improvements in Valdorian prosperity. "Your Majesty," King Harold said during a private conversation, "I must admit that I was skeptical about the stability of your realm when news of King Edmund's disappearance first reached us. But what I've observed today suggests that Valdoria has actually been strengthened by these events rather than weakened." "Thank you, Your Majesty," Isabel replied. "I believe that effective leadership can emerge from many sources, and that kingdoms benefit when authority is based on demonstrated competence rather than accident of birth alone." It was a carefully diplomatic way of suggesting that her own rise to power represented a more merit-based approach to governance, while avoiding any direct criticism of traditional monarchical systems. As the evening progressed and the celebration continued, Isabel found herself reflecting on the complex emotions surrounding her coronation. There was satisfaction in having achieved her goal of becoming queen, pride in the improvements she had brought to Valdoria, and excitement about the opportunities that lay ahead. But there was also a deep awareness of the challenges that would inevitably arise as she worked to consolidate her new position and implement her vision for the kingdom's future. Duke Blackwood approached her as the feast was winding down, his expression suggesting that he had something significant to say. Despite his public opposition to many of her policies, he had maintained the basic courtesy required by his position and his long service to the crown. "Your Majesty," he said with a formal bow, "while I have not always agreed with your methods or your pace of change, I cannot deny the results you have achieved. You have proven yourself as a leader, and I pledge my loyalty to your reign." Coming from Blackwood, this declaration carried enormous significance. As the kingdom's most senior military commander and one of its most traditional nobles, his acceptance of Isabel's authority would influence many others who had been uncertain about supporting a female monarch. "Thank you, Your Grace," Isabel replied. "I value your experience and your counsel, even when we disagree. Strong kingdoms benefit from diverse perspectives and honest debate." As the coronation day drew to a close, Queen Isabel stood once again on the balcony of her royal study, now officially the sovereign ruler of the Kingdom of Valdoria. The city below was illuminated by thousands of celebratory lights, and the sounds of continued festivities echoed through the night air. The woman who had entered Valdoria 12 years ago as a diplomatic bride had achieved something unprecedented in the kingdom's long history. But even as she savored this moment of triumph, she knew that her greatest challenges lay ahead. Being crowned queen was one thing, ruling effectively and maintaining power was quite another. The next phase of her reign would require her to deliver on the promises she had made, to manage the competing interests of different factions within her kingdom, and to navigate the complex international relationships that would determine Valdoria's future prosperity and security. But for tonight, as fireworks lit up the sky over Aurelius and thousands of her subjects celebrated in the streets below, Queen Isabel Morwen allowed herself to fully appreciate what she had accomplished. She had transformed herself from a foreign consort into a legitimate monarch, and, in the process, she had begun to transform the Kingdom of Valdoria into something new and potentially greater than it had ever been before. The crown that had been symbolically placed on King Edmund's pillow 8 months ago now rested securely on her own head, representing not just a change in leadership, but a fundamental evolution in how royal authority could be earned, exercised, and legitimized. The age of Queen Isabel had officially begun. 2 years had transformed the Kingdom of Valdoria beyond recognition. As Queen Isabel stood in her private chambers on the anniversary of her coronation, she could see evidence of that transformation in every direction she looked. The capital city of Aurelius had grown by nearly a third, with new districts housing the merchants, craftsmen, and administrators who had flocked to serve the increasingly prosperous kingdom. Trade caravans moved constantly along improved roads, carrying Valdorian goods to markets that hadn't existed during Edmund's reign. But success had brought new challenges that tested every aspect of Isabel's leadership and political acumen. The rapid changes she had implemented had created tensions both within Valdoria and among neighboring kingdoms that viewed her growing power with increasing concern. The morning brought news that would force her to confront the most serious threat to her reign since she had first claimed the crown. Sir Adrian Montclair entered the royal study carrying dispatches that bore the urgent seals of multiple intelligence sources. His expression immediately told Isabel that the news was significant and troubling. "Your Majesty," Adrian began, his usual calm demeanor showing signs of strain, "we've received confirmation of what our agents have been reporting for weeks. A coalition of noble houses from 3 neighboring kingdoms is forming with the explicit goal of removing you from power and restoring what they term legitimate male rule to Valdoria." Isabel had been expecting something like this for months. Her success in transforming Valdoria had inevitably attracted attention from rulers who saw her as either a threat to their own authority or an opportunity to claim valuable territory. The fact that she was a woman ruling in her own right rather than as a regent for a male heir made her an attractive target for those who questioned the legitimacy of female sovereignty. "Which kingdoms are involved?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Aldwych, despite King Harold's apparent friendship, is providing financial support. The Kingdom of Westmarch is offering military advisors and equipment. Most concerning, the Empire of Drakmore has promised direct military assistance if the coalition can establish a foothold within our borders." This was more serious than Isabel had anticipated. The Empire of Drakmore was the largest and most powerful realm on the continent, capable of fielding armies that could overwhelm Valdoria's defenses if they chose to intervene directly. The fact that they were willing to support efforts to remove her suggested that her success had been perceived as a regional threat rather than simply a local political curiosity. "What about domestic support for this coalition?" Isabel inquired, knowing that external threats were only dangerous if they could connect with internal dissatisfaction. Limited, but not negligible, Adrian replied grimly. Brother Marcus has been in communication with religious leaders in other kingdoms, spreading the message that your rule violates divine law. Some of the traditional noble families who lost influence under your reforms are quietly expressing support for restoration. Most concerning, there are reports that someone claiming to be King Edmund has appeared in Westmarch, gathering supporters for a return to Valdoria. This last piece of news struck Isabel like a physical blow. She knew exactly where Edmund was and what he was doing, and it definitely did not involve political organizing in Westmarch. Someone was either impersonating the former king or using his name to legitimize their own ambitions. Either scenario represented a serious threat to the stability she had worked so hard to create. The morning continued with a series of meetings that highlighted the complex challenges facing Queen Isabel's reign. Lady Margaret Hartwell reported that the kingdom's improved economic position was actually creating new vulnerabilities, as increased prosperity had made Valdoria an attractive target for both conquest and economic infiltration. The very success of our trade policies is now being used against us, Hartwell explained as she spread financial documents across the royal study table. Foreign merchants are flooding our markets with goods priced below cost, attempting to destroy our domestic industries. Meanwhile, our increased tax revenues have made it possible for enemy agents to bribe officials and gather intelligence about our military capabilities. Duke William Blackwood arrived next, bringing military assessments that confirmed Isabel's worst fears about the external threats facing the kingdom. Despite his initial opposition to her rule, Blackwood had become one of her most valuable advisors, his long experience and strategic thinking proving invaluable as challenges mounted. Your Majesty, Blackwood said with the direct manner that had made him famous throughout Valdoria, our intelligence suggests that the coalition forces are planning to invade from 3 directions simultaneously. The goal is to overwhelm our defenses and capture the capital before we can organize effective resistance. What are our defensive capabilities? Isabel asked, though she had been monitoring military preparations carefully. Better than they were 2 years ago, but not sufficient to repel a coordinated attack from 3 major kingdoms simultaneously. We've improved training and equipment, but we haven't had time to significantly expand the size of our forces. We're looking at odds of roughly 3-1 against us. This was the moment that would define Isabel's reign and determine whether her transformation of Valdoria would survive or be destroyed by those who opposed change. She had anticipated that success would eventually provoke external challenges, but the scale and coordination of the threat exceeded her worst-case planning. How much time do we have before they move against us? She inquired. Based on the intelligence we're receiving, probably no more than 6 weeks. They're waiting for winter weather to reduce the effectiveness of our mobile defenses, but they don't want to delay long enough for us to seek military assistance from potential allies. Isabel spent the next several hours in intense consultation with her advisors, reviewing every possible response to the mounting crisis. The options ranged from diplomatic attempts to split the coalition to military strategies that might allow Valdoria to survive long enough for circumstances to change. But every scenario led back to the same fundamental reality. She was facing enemies with superior resources and numbers, and traditional defensive strategies were unlikely to succeed. It was during this crisis that Isabel's greatest strengths as a leader became apparent. Rather than simply reacting to external threats, she began to develop a comprehensive strategy that would transform the challenge into an opportunity to permanently secure her position and establish Valdoria as a major regional power. Adrian, she said as afternoon shadows began to lengthen across the royal study, send messages to every kingdom on the continent that has not joined the coalition against us. Offer them immediate and substantial trade concessions in exchange for diplomatic recognition of my legitimacy and promises of non-interference. That could be expensive, Your Majesty, Lady Hartwell observed. Trade concessions reduce our revenue and might weaken our economic position. Short-term costs, Isabel replied. If we survive this crisis, we'll have time to renegotiate more favorable terms. If we don't survive, economic efficiency becomes irrelevant. The strategy was characteristically bold and innovative. Instead of simply trying to defend against the coalition, Isabel was working to isolate her enemies diplomatically while building her own network of international support. The trade concessions would give other kingdoms economic incentives to oppose any disruption of the profitable relationships they were developing with Valdoria. Duke Blackwood, she continued, I want you to develop plans for asymmetric warfare that makes invasion as costly as possible for our enemies. We may not be able to defeat their armies in traditional battles, but we can make conquest expensive enough that they question whether the benefits justify the costs. Blackwood nodded approvingly. Guerrilla tactics, disrupted supply lines, fortified positions that require siege warfare. We can make every mile they advance cost them significantly more than it costs us. Exactly. But I also want you to prepare our forces for mobile operations that could take the fighting to enemy territory if necessary. If they want to destabilize our kingdom, we should be prepared to return the favor. As evening approached, Isabel convened an emergency session of the Royal Council to formally address the external threats and secure domestic support for the challenging months ahead. The council chamber had been reconfigured since her coronation to reflect the more collaborative approach to governance she had implemented. But tonight the atmosphere was tense and focused as never before. My lords and ladies, Isabel began, her voice carrying the authority she had developed over 2 years of effective rule. We face the most serious challenge to our kingdom's independence since its founding 8 centuries ago. Foreign powers have decided that Valdoria's success under our new governance represents a threat that must be eliminated. She went on to detail the intelligence they had received about the coalition and its plans, presenting the information in a way that emphasized both the seriousness of the threat and the opportunities it created for those who responded effectively. However, she continued, I believe this crisis also represents an opportunity to permanently establish Valdoria as a major power on this continent. If we can defeat this coalition, we will demonstrate that our new form of governance is not only legitimate, but superior to the traditional systems that our enemies represent. Lord Ravencrest was the first to respond, his support for Isabel's rule having only strengthened as the benefits of her leadership became apparent. Your Majesty, what specific support do you need from the noble houses to implement your defense strategy? Financial resources, military levies, and, most importantly, unified political support that demonstrates to our enemies and potential allies that Valdoria stands united behind its queen, Isabel replied. Any signs of internal division will encourage our enemies and discourage potential supporters. The discussion that followed was remarkably different from the contentious debates that had characterized her early months as regent. 2 years of successful governance had created a level of trust and confidence that allowed for frank strategic planning rather than political maneuvering. Even former skeptics like Duke Blackwood were now fully committed to defending the realm under Isabel's leadership. Lady Hartwell presented financial projections showing how the kingdom could fund an extended military campaign while maintaining the domestic programs that had generated popular support for the monarchy. We have sufficient reserves to maintain current military spending for 18 months, longer if we can continue current trade relationships with non-aligned kingdoms. The meeting concluded with unanimous approval for a comprehensive defense strategy that combined diplomatic, economic, and military elements designed to not only survive the immediate crisis, but emerge from it in a stronger position than before. It was exactly the kind of innovative, multifaceted approach that had characterized Isabel's entire reign. Over the following weeks, as winter weather began to affect travel and military operations, the full scope of Isabel's strategy became apparent. Diplomatic missions traveled to kingdoms throughout the continent, offering trade agreements and mutual defense pacts that created incentives for neutrality or support. Economic policies were adjusted to maximize revenue while maintaining the domestic prosperity that ensured popular backing for the war effort. Most importantly, Isabel personally took command of the information war that would determine how the conflict was perceived both within Valdoria and internationally. She had learned during her rise to power that controlling the narrative was often more important than controlling territory, and she applied those lessons to the current crisis. The question, she explained to Sir Adrian as they reviewed propaganda strategies, is whether this conflict is seen as legitimate resistance to a usurper or as an unprovoked attack on a successful and legitimate kingdom. If we can establish the latter narrative, our enemies become aggressors rather than liberators, which changes how other kingdoms calculate their own interests. The winter months passed in intensive preparation, but also in continued governance that demonstrated Isabel's commitment to the welfare of her people even during wartime. Infrastructure projects continued, trade relationships were maintained wherever possible, and social programs that had improved life for ordinary Valdorians were preserved despite the military emergency. As spring approached and the threat of invasion became imminent, Queen Isabel stood once again in her royal study, but now as a monarch who had proven herself capable of managing the most serious challenges a ruler could face. She had transformed a dynastic succession crisis into an opportunity to modernize an entire kingdom. She had converted potential political weakness into diplomatic and economic strength. Now she would discover whether she could transform external threats into permanent security and international recognition. The woman who had once been dismissed as a mere diplomatic bride was about to face the ultimate test of leadership. But as she looked out over the capital city that had flourished under her rule, as she considered the loyal advisors who had joined her cause, and as she reflected on the strength and prosperity that her policies had created, Queen Isabel Morwen felt confident that whatever challenges lay ahead, she had built something in Valdoria that was worth defending and capable of surviving. The crown that had begun this story as a symbol of abandoned authority had become a representation of earned legitimacy and effective governance. The Kingdom of Valdoria had been transformed from a traditional monarchy struggling with succession questions into a dynamic realm that was reshaping regional politics through innovation rather than conquest. The greatest test of Queen Isabel's reign was about to begin, but she had already proven that sometimes the most unlikely paths to power can lead to the most effective and enduring forms of leadership. The shadow of the crown had become the substance of real authority, and the Kingdom of Valdoria was ready to defend what it had become and fight for what it could still become under the rule of its remarkable queen.